Hello and welcome to this presentation on the relationship between Epicurean philosophy and logic. One of the questions we frequently run into when we discuss Epicurus with people who are new to the philosophy is that they'll ask, what is this I've heard about Epicurus being an enemy of logic? They'll say that they've read Principal Doctrine 16, which says that, quote, in but few things chance hinders a wise man, but the greatest and most important matters reason has ordained, and throughout the whole period of life does and will ordain. But then they'll also say that they've read the biography of Epicurus by Diogenes Laertius, and they've read in that biography that, quote, Epicurus rejected logic as misleading. How do we reconcile those two statements, which apparently place reason and logic in opposition to each other? That's the question our panel from the EpicureanFriends.com forum is going to address today. I was going to say briefly about why the topic came up as an introduction. Martin brought to our attention that Epicurus had some unusual positions to take about logic, which are stated several times in some of the texts that we have, including the one that is frequently on my mind, which is Cicero's De Finibus. In Book 1, there's a section where Torquatus is talking, and he says, was he to occupy himself like Plato with music and geometry, arithmetic and astronomy, which starting from false premises cannot be true, and which, moreover, if they were true, would contribute nothing to make our lives pleasanter and therefore better. And in addition to that, there are a series of other statements in the text that are relevant to this, including really rather than trying to read the majority of, or really any of them, I'll just focus on the fact that in particular, what is recorded as Huehne 376 is a discussion where Cicero records that, and I will read this, they will not get Epicurus, who despises and laughs at the whole of dialectic, to admit the validity of a proposition of the form, quote, her Marcus will either be alive tomorrow or not alive, while dialecticians demand that every disjunctive proposition of the form, quote, either X or not X, end quote, is not only valid, but even necessary. See how on guard the man is whom your friends think slow. For if he says, I admit either of the two to be necessary, it will follow that her Marcus must either be alive tomorrow or not alive. But as a matter of fact, in the nature of things, no such necessity exists. End quote. Therefore, let the dialecticians, that is, Antiochus and the Stoics, do battle with this philosopher, for he overthrows the whole of dialectic. And that's really just a sample of a number of passages that are in the Epicurean text in which Epicurus is at odds with what is variously described as dialectic. And I think the position to call that simply logic is overbroad. And so this is where really Martin's presentation, I think, is going to take off, is that as we discuss something like that, as I discuss it frequently, it's important not to overstate the case. In other words, what Martin's going to explain through these truth tables is that you can start from a false premise in a truth table in formal logic and still end up with a true result, which is counterintuitive to people who think on a very common sense level, such as me, if I even attain that level sometimes. And so we've got a divergence in opinion and thought between Epicurus and the majority of Greek philosophers that we have to understand the details and where it comes from, where it goes, what it leads to, what the implications are, and things like that. And so we have the Epicurean material in the text that we frequently talk about, but I don't have a strong understanding whatsoever of formal logic and how you can have false premises but still end up with a true conclusion. So with that, I think Martin is going to talk to us tonight about formal logic and how truth tables work. And maybe after hearing what's going on there and Martin telling us about the connection between that and reality, which I think is where we're going to end up tonight, is that truth tables and formal logic are not necessarily connected with reality. But until you understand the two pieces, Epicurus' position and then the truth table formal logic position, it's hard for a layman person of ordinary intelligence to understand what's even being discussed. So Martin is going to explain it to us, and then we'll discuss what Martin presents to us. Is that a halfway fair statement, Martin?
Yes, yes.
Okay, well, take it away.
Okay, yeah. So first I have to apologize for the formal logic thing. So that was what I said, because I didn't know the proper English word. So what's the English word is propositional logic for this. And the reason why I take this, because if you just take words, you can talk on ends and not resolve the problem. But I was always accustomed to use formulas, and this propositional logic uses formulas, and in these formulas with truth tables, you see immediately how these things work, and that should then resolve this. I also found another explanation for the how to verbalize it, and I come to that after the presentation. So let's first go through propositional logic. So, and what I found here, this tutorial from academic institution, this one is pretty much covers what I need, and what I need in addition that I topped up with my own edition. So what I show here first is the tutorial from, I forgot now, the link is somewhere there from the institution that is, and pass through. So first is how to create and use truth tables, and learn how to use logic operations, and then explain the operations in propositions. But anyway, something like that. We then see how it's done, and in addition, then on tautologies, which will also help a bit on how to resolve this apparent discrepancy.
Martin, before you go further, let me state one question for everybody. Do you prefer that everybody wait till the end to ask you questions, or if one of the people on the panel here tonight wants to ask a question, should they interrupt you? Which do you prefer?
You can interrupt immediately, because that makes for a more lively discussion, I've found.
Okay, good. I wanted everybody to understand. I know we have a very polite bunch of people who probably would not jump in unless they had the go ahead to do that. So.
Yeah, it's also better to remove blockade, also obstacles to understanding immediately, because then it's easier to follow the remainder of the presentation instead of having to rewind everything if that difficulty is at the beginning.
Right. Okay.
So what?
Let's call it reality.
Yeah. So P can be a statement about reality. It can be just a statement within logic. So if you, the mathematicians own this basically. I mean, philosophers as well, and they use truth tables essentially in the same way, but they have some other primary concerns of there. The thing is that for mathematicians, they have only logic. When they develop a particular certain theory or topic like calculus or something like this, so they start off with a suitably chosen set of axioms, which may or may not be motivated by what we see in reality, and then they make some suitable definitions, and then in the next in the further course, then they try to show that set of axioms has no contradictions, and it's minimal. That means none of the axioms in there can be deduced from the other axioms. Now, unfortunately, we don't have Ellie here, because Ellie would protest immediately, because the meaning of the word axiom, even though it comes from Greek, is different from how it's in Greek language. So this is a typical thing in mathematics, that they grab a word and then give it its own definition. So with axioms is apparently the same thing, so that it's no more the same meaning as it had actually in the Greek language.
So a quick question, Martin. So then if P is a variable, then can P be something, for instance, like the statement, Martin is male, and then it can be either true or false? Is that the kind of
yes, exactly.
statement we're thinking? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And is this analogous to just like a premise, what we think of as like a syllogistic logic?
Exactly. That's where I will come through. And if we express a syllogism in a truth table, we can identify which of the variables are premises and which is then the conclusion. So we will have that too. And then when we look at this, then in order for the truth table to be useful for variables p and q in all its all possible combinations, and then what is the result for p and q? No? So if p is false and q is false, then also of course p and q are false. No? And if one of them is false, no matter whether the other one is true, it's still p and q is false. So all the characteristics of the operation AND are that if both variables are true, only then the AND operation of this variable is true too. And this one you can add more and more variables to this with the same effect. You always keep zeros only when everything is true. Then you have for the end a true in there. It will just become longer, but that is this property of AND. Huh? And other operations which are frequently used are OR, then the implication, which then is then expanded into from there we expand it into a syllogism, and we have the equivalence, which for us is useful because it may also help to resolve this counterintuitive behavior of implications. Yeah, the not operation we had already an example, so this is the same thing explained again, so that we have this truth table starting for a variable p. For not p, then we get this second column here. Yeah, and as an example, here they just put a variable cat, and the not p is not a cat. No? And like I said, it's better to use only propositions for variables, and then that statement could mean that object, that white thing over there is a cat, no? And not p is then something like it is not a cat, no? Or tired. No? That means I can state I am tired, and then the not p would be I am not tired. No? So this one links directly to how we talk, and there should be no discrepancy. Yeah, for the AND operation, as I just explained already, so it's put here together again. And here's now something what when I in the recent discussion, when I put it up for truth table, I used the symbol for times. Now here's I just used in this point for times, because this one is formally the same as multiplication is on for a computer who uses binary numbers. There then each number can be expressed as a binary number instead of decimal like we use, with only 0 and 1 as figures allowed who displays a number. And at the very basic level of multiplying one binary number with another one, we get the very same truth table. That means we have 3 times 0, and once we have only the one coming up. Yeah, so that means now the use as variables on this slide, the examples tired and hungry, so adjectives, and then if you just use the AND operation, then P and Q in this one would be tired and hungry. Huh? And then if we apply a not, then this one, if it's written like this, it means it applies directly to the first variable, but not to the whole operation. So that means not P and Q means not tired, with a not relating only to the tired, and hungry. And correspondingly, if we move that not operation to the second variable, we have tired and not hungry as the meaning of this one. And this one is then again This one is now this one we need to switch to my additions. No? So this was the explanation of the AND operation. And now you see, if you go back to here, we have so 0, 0, 1. And in that tutorial, they made the mistake just copying it and forgot to edit it. No? So it's quite obvious for OR operation, it has to be like this. And in the later overview table, they actually show it correctly. So let me switch to, ouch, now I closed it. And yeah, so this is now the correct truth table for OR. No? So we have two variables, P and Q. And if neither of them is true, then P or Q is also false. No? And if P is false and Q is true, then P or Q means it's true. No? And if P is true and Q is false, then P or Q is also true. And here is now a more precise rendering of OR as compared to how it's used in speaking. So in speaking, the meaning of OR is a bit ambiguous. That it can mean that it's just either or that it's what is often written as and/or. No? And in logic, the word or displayed with this one means if both are true, then the result of that or operation is again true. So this is not an either or, it's just an or. No? Also it's a type of and or, no? Not either or. Either or would have a zero here, but this or in logic is then true when both variables are true.
Hey, Martin, I wonder if being in librarianship, they talk about Boolean logic in searching databases and things like that. Does this have analogies to Boolean logic? Do you know?
Yeah. Yes. Another word for this one will be Boolean logic.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Good.
Mm-hmm. Because this one, when you do this binary number representation, that one is often called Boolean, and
okay.
So anything called Boolean logic would be the same. So there are variations of this. Like me, I didn't know the proper English word, so I just used formal logic, but I meant the very same thing.
Cool.
And sometimes people call it classical logic, or so there are different words out for this one, and it always means, yeah. And I prefer to write things more compact. So instead of having now a separate column for each variable and then one for the resulting operation, we can more compact write it differently by just putting this one essentially in one column, and then write directly under the subcolumns the values for what is true or not. So the only thing what is then changed is the order how it appears, and we have no more the intervals between the cells. So P or Q, then what is here, this or 0, 1, 1, 1 shows up now in the middle under the or sign. So this is how this more compact way works. No? It's the same. But in this case, we need to keep better track of in which order we fill it in. So by doing it in parallel, like in that tutorial, we need to be less careful about in which order we do that. Let's go back to the tutorial. But the explanation there is correct. No? So be aware, if you look again at this one, that this slide number 11 is wrong, the table. So let's jump to the implication. And with this one, we can come closer to what motivated this presentation. So we have a premise P, and here the conclusion is Q. And if we then put all the four possibilities we can have for two variables again, so we have first two columns false for P, and next two columns true for P, and then for each of these, then we have in the first and third one, Q is false, and the other two, Q is true.
And Martin, the big point that we're making here, and what you made the comment on about a minute ago, is in that first line, both the P and the Q are false, but the conclusion is true.
And on the operation, the operation P implies Q. Yeah, so that one we see then. So the only case which the implication does not allow is if the premise is true, then the conclusion must not be false. So this is the only case where an implication is false. No? So if P is true, then Q must be true. No? And if P is false, then Q can be either false or true. Both is still within the definition of the implication.
So you've got a situation here where under propositional logic, you've got a construction, P implies Q, in which both P and Q are false, but you've constructed it in such a way that your conclusion is true. And that's what prompted this conversation, right? Because Epicurus and what normal people think is that if your premise starts out being false, there's no way to arrive at a true conclusion. But under propositional logic, it can be arrived at. Is that correct? A correct statement of it?
Yeah, except it was displayed wrongly. I used the wrong word. So if P, then Q is here called an operation, implication operation. So what we have here is the conclusion is Q and the premise is P. And I think if we keep this distinction, then it's we should be able to resolve this apparent discrepancy between the common understanding how logic works and how it is shown in the truth table for if then. So that means P is the premise and Q is the conclusion. And if P, then Q is just an operation. And then the value for this operation is then true if both the premise and the conclusion are false.
I think this is where we fall apart from common measures of understanding. So we better really focus on how you can have a operation that starts with a false premise and comes up with a false conclusion, and yet the premise and yet the construction, the operation is true.
Yeah, this is because this is we can take this as a definition of the implication. So I mean, if we have if P, then Q, and if P is false, then Q can be false. So that is then a true thing.
And another word for that might be valid. Is that correct? That's a valid construction.
This one I wanted to come to, because this may also help. This different use of words may help to shed light on the issue. So we are primarily considered with truth and false, but the mathematicians, when they present it, are concerned with what they call validity, because for them, like I said before, logic is the only thing they have. So they need to make sure that their logic is sound, because otherwise everything they derive based on it is wrong. The whole part of mathematics will be wrong if the logic is found out to be wrong. So mathematicians are just concerned with validity, and then they can proceed with it. Philosophers is differently. Philosophers want to have these go to something like applicable to something real, and that means they want to see that an argument is sound. So even though the truth tables philosophers use and mathematicians use are the same, they are no different. What the focus, the primary concern of the mathematicians is validity, and then the truth and false things just flows out of from this one. And for the philosophers, it's being sound. So for a person who does not know these distinctions, some of this in the formal logic may sound really counterintuitive. So if you now take this truth table for how the implication operation works, So you from that viewpoint, you just take it as a precise definition of the meaning of the if-then. So what we use in common language as if P then Q. So this is expressed like this. No? So if your premise is false, no? Then of course we would expect in common logic that then also the conclusion is false. That means the operation P or Q, then the definition is correct. Yes. So this is valid. Huh? I mean, this is true. Huh? So that the operation if then for combining a false premise and getting at a false conclusion is true. And
why, Martin? Why? What is it about that arrow symbol that allows you to convert a 0 in column 1 and a 0 in column 2 to a 1 in column 3? I would have thought that you would have carried over a 0 into the third column. What is it about the arrow that tells you that you should put a 1 there instead of a 0? Don't worry, you're just speaking for Aristotle and every other propositional logician for the last 2,000 years here. So no pressure.
So how? Yeah, because it's just an operation. So don't take this P implies Q as something like a conclusion. Just take it as a description. What happens if you combine P and Q with the operation if then?
Well, why would you get a 1 instead of just another 0? If I was adding the two together, I would get a 0. If I was multiplying them together, I'd probably get a 0. What is it that tells you to put something other than a 0 in that third column?
Okay, let's maybe go to what they use as an example. Huh? So again, they use an adjective, but I would rather use this adjective as a proposition. So when they just write hungry, then I would say I am hungry. Huh? And so this is the premise is I am hungry, and the conclusion is I eat. Huh? And then the operation of if then is if I am hungry, I eat. Huh?
Are you not assuming facts that are totally outside of that table that you had on the page before?
No, so the way it's written here in language, basically, if you express it accurately, it expresses the last line in this truth table. The way it's written there, if I'm hungry and I eat, it would just look like it expresses this one. But this yeah. So
what am I complaining about? The fact that the table does not contain enough facts to satisfy me? Is that the basis of my question, or why does it bother me that you can look at that table and come up with a 1 in that third column by just looking at an arrow? I guess as I'm talking myself through it, I guess that's my problem is that I'm rejecting the idea that the table itself can mirror reality. Is that what the problem is?
I don't think this is a problem. So now so if you play this through, so if I'm not hungry, I do not eat. So that means.
But those are words that have nothing to do with the arrow symbol, right? I mean, I guess you're just presuming it to be the case, but
this seems to be a deductive formulation, is it not?
Yes. So, but later that logically, it can also be expressed differently. So okay. It's so if I'm hungry, I do not eat. If I'm not hungry, I do not eat. That means P is false and Q is false, and that means the operation from if P then Q is true, because if I'm not hungry and I don't eat, then it's still true.
Right. Yeah, I can see that. Because the statement P is if I am hungry, the conclusion is then I eat. But if I am hungry is a false statement, which means you're not hungry, then you don't eat, which is the opposite of Q. So then that is a true statement. So that's why you get a 1 at the end if you have 2 false statements within that implication.
Yes. Huh? So this is this case, and the trivial case is this. This is how it looks there at the superficial level, and it's stated there. So the first and the last row should not be controversial, and this one, the third one, should also not be controversial, because we have the case that I am hungry, huh? And I do not eat, and that's false, huh? Because if I'm hungry, we established this before. I eat, but if I don't eat, that means this is then not what this operation prescribes, and then here is false. Huh? So the critical portion is here. So how is it that I'm not hungry but I eat? Huh? So, and this is the one which is a bit counterintuitive. Huh?
I will say, and I may be jumping the gun here, but I will say that I find it odd in that one spot that Cassius had posted, the one about where is it? Is it 376? Let's just use the word. Let's just use the name Tom, because since I can't find the actual name, it says so Tom will be alive tomorrow, or Tom
Marcus.
will not be alive. Mark will not be alive tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I mean, are those? So can you use those as a P and Q, not in an implication, but in another thing to show why Epicurus would not have accepted that as a valid statement?
Yeah,
from the truth tables.
I found an interesting comment on this one, and I think this is exactly the reason why Epicurus rejected this one. So it has nothing to do with this implication. It's because in order to be a statement, it has to be able to establish to be true or false. But today we cannot establish whether it's true or false.
There's no necessary connection between the two. The word necessary comes into play, right, Martin?
Right.
No?
Exactly. And the reasoning is, if we would accept this, that means we would already imply hard determinism as that means we only allow hard determinism, and Epicurus was rejecting hard determinism. So this is why the statement would not be allowed. If people accept hard determinism, they would not have a problem with this. And this is what we see. So if we talk about deterministic processes, then we can overcome this. No? So then we know that we can predict based on what we know now, what will be in the future. And by experience, to go through this, we can establish this. So that means for deterministic processes, we can do this. And here's a problem where quantum theory then reveals this thing, because in quantum theory, we can have a situation which is not deterministic. That means the state we have now doesn't determine what's in the future. So there is a probability which outcome will be. And that means this binary logic does not, the simple binary logic does not apply. And so quantum theory, where we have this non-determinism, Epicurus is right. And the same thing happened before already in classical thermodynamics, but people didn't see it. Because there the problem sits deeper, and people didn't recognize it. But it's the same problem. Both in thermodynamics and in quantum mechanics, we have to deal with just having probabilities. We don't know more. And that means then we cannot stay this stated like what is there presented by Epicurus.
So there's actually a name for that. I think it's called explosive logic, or is something like that. I'm remembering this from college. I took a course in formal logic. What's up?
That's good. So that means you can confirm or refute if I say something wrong.
Well, hopefully, if I remember it. But I think that particular formulation is called explosive logic or implosive logic or something.
Yeah, I don't know that term. So I couldn't comment on that one now.
Something we'll have to look up. I don't have a web browser handy, but
Okay. So now in order to resolve this, to convince Cassius, let's go for
It's all about convincing Cassius. Yes.
Well, that's absolutely right. And of course, Cassius is not going to change his mind that propositional logic is useless in respect to persons, times, and places, as I've learned tonight from Plutarch 129.2 and Stobius's Anthology, where he says, Epicurus says that chance is a cause which is uncertain with respect to persons, times, and places. So that seems to be where we're going, right, guys? That Epicurus doesn't really care about the propositional logic in regard to what we might call inanimate matter, which you can be certain is not going to be influenced by inanimate matter is controlled by necessity, at least in Epicurus's view.
I wouldn't even say that. It seems to me what he's saying is if you want to say that, that rock on top of the hill will either be on top of the hill tomorrow or it will have rolled down the hill tomorrow, he'll say that no, you can't say that either because you don't know what tomorrow is going to bring and you don't know what you can. So that would be my.
Yeah, we're at least for the moment, and this is something obvious. All these statements that certainly I'm making are subject to revision and extension later on and so forth. But I'm thinking, Don, that the limitation there would be that Epicurus also said that everything else in the world is in fact deterministic from the formation of the world, which is that reference in the letter to Herodotus. And I'm thinking that Epicurus draws a bright line in terms of escape from necessity at
Is that because of free will?
Because of free will is what I would say is what he's saying in regard to this 80th comment in U380. But and of course that's tentative. I don't want to. I don't know what I'm talking about 3/4 of the time. So certainly even right now.
But you say it with conviction. That's the important thing.
Well, I think clearly Epicurus had an important point here that he thought was necessary to make, and the point probably is in regard to human free will and agency, and to break out of necessity there, because the classic example that everybody gives from this Huehne 376 is the question you brought up a minute ago about Hermarchus not being alive tomorrow or alive tomorrow. And I would predict that we're going to conclude over time that the issue there is that Hermarchus is a human and he has influence over the ability to be alive or not. He has agency, so it cannot be there is no way to necessarily conclude which of the two it will be. But in most things with physics, like Martin's talking about, you can predict with certainty.
Well, but not always, and we see this in Epicurus already. So he introduced, to save in a materialistic world, to save the indeterminacy, he introduced at the atomistic level the uncertainty, and this one carries over also in the inanimate world. No? It's just that in many cases it averages out, but there are cases where it doesn't average out, and where we can see the consequences without that life is involved. No? Okay, that is a digression. So let's now come to the equivalence as the savior. So the equivalence is a similar operation, and that one behaves then differently. So there we have it such that if the premise is false and the conclusion is true, then this equivalence operation is false. And this is more something what the way how you Cassius interprets the implication. But this one is now here represented by a double arrow, because if we take this as premise and conclusion, we now have a symmetry. So that means the P implies Q and Q implies P. This is called equivalence.
This sounds a lot like law of identity that people want to talk about from Aristotle. Is that what you're talking about? I mean, clearly, if two things are the same, you define them as the same. I would think that becomes a lot easier to reach a conclusion about.
Yeah, it could be that it's meant like this. I'm not familiar what Aristotle writes about this, but it looks like that, not from the way how the equivalence works. Yeah, and then something what is then used in a lot in mathematical proofs is this tautology. So if you establish a truth table and everything is then true, then this is called a tautology, or if the mathematicians consider this as important, they call it a theorem, and it then often has a name. So here is an example of this. So if you have P and Q or R, so that one is equivalent with P and Q or P and R. So if we look then at this statement, it's always true. So this is a tautology. Another example is that P and Q implies P. It's also tautology. Yeah. Okay. So this is a part. These are the foundations of it. And now let's go back to my additions. So here's again. Here is the what was again the OR table. And now if we have a syllogism, it's an expansion of the implication. So in this case, for a syllogism, we have two premises and a conclusion. So now Q denotes a premise, and the new variable R is therefore the conclusion. And then what we get is we have then, of course, 8 different possibilities, and we apply then the rules for the conclusion. So here in this first step, I just put in the truth, all possible truth values for the variables. And then we look for the result for the end. So in my shorter notation, I just put that one directly under the symbol for end, what the result is. And as you can verify by going through it, well, this one should be undisputed be the result. So only the last 2 lines have a true for the end. And if we apply the definition of the implication, then we get what is now written under the arrow as a result for the for that implication. So, and this is then the result of the syllogism. And what we see here is the first 6 rows here is that if we have anything in the among the premises is false, then the implication operation result is true. And only the case when both premises are true, if then the conclusion is false, this is something not allowed by the implication. So it just carries on this property from the basic property of the implication. So it's the same thing in the syllogism. Yeah, and now so maybe I just read this because this is to keep this in mind. So propositional logic refers to the way we think. So it just formalizing what it means when we talk about if, then, and things like that. And just logic alone does not make any claim about the real world. So and if what we put in there in our variables, the result remains within logic. It has nothing to do with the real world. So by just using this truth table, so you consider this just is merely a game with rules. So you apply these rules and then you get this. Whether this has any bearing on reality doesn't matter. But of course, we are interested in philosophy and physics to really make use of this. And we find that the world is pretty logic. And then we need to put in empirical results for these premises. Of course, if it's empirical, we often do not really have full certainty. It's something, so a set of experiments shows this, experiment shows one result, and but another set of experiments later on may show something else, so that things can be refuted. Especially in medical research, we have this a lot. Just one comment, I hope it's not too political. So there were some studies which shows that ivermectin is an effective treatment for the COVID-19, and but later studies then found out this is not the case. Plus, the examination of those studies which found this were done wrongly, which unfortunately happens quite often because biologists and doctors are not experts in statistics and they make a lot of mistakes. I myself had a lot work in the area of analytical chemistry, and I show the same there. So a lot of analytical chemists do not know what they're doing with statistics, and then they come up with wrong methodology. And in medicine, it's even worse, because I know a bit on how doctors are trained, what would be future medical doctors are trained, and their training is even more superficial than that of analytical chemists. No? So it's no surprise to me, but there are exceptions. So those doctors who do not just do their degree to get the title to lure patients, but to really do some substantial research, then those doctors usually, many of them, they because that is really their bread and butter on medical studies, they get an understanding. Like Elaine. Elaine knows these statistics very well, and and she, when she went through the literature study, she also is able to go to really read a research paper and fully understand it, which most practitioners probably will not be able to do, and that is okay, because the practitioner doesn't have to worry about this. His strength is how to heal patients. Now he knows how to do that, especially with his experience, and then he does not need to worry that much about it. But of course, if he can do it, it's best, because then he will be up to date with the latest result and not treat his patients with ivermectin.
Martin, you certainly did hit on a controversial subject right there that we probably won't be able to resolve, obviously, tonight. But I noticed that this last paragraph, just in case the visual doesn't come through when we put a podcast together, I noticed you probably read the first sentence, but then you stopped reading and started paraphrasing. If indeed this last paragraph is something you wrote, it's probably worth your reading the whole thing so we have it recorded for those who listen to the audio version, because I think you've made a lot of firm statements in there that would be good to memorialize.
Exactly. So I start again from where I cut off in the middle of the sentence. To properly apply logic to the real world, empirical results for whether promises are true or false, and for whether implication is actually applicable to the situation, are needed. Misleading rhetors may falsely assume that a premise is true, which is not true, or they may apply implication to a case where applicability of implication is not just. Another variant of such misleading with logic is to hide that additional premises are needed for an implication to be applicable. Proof tables are a tool to get clear propositional logic and to keep the overview when rhetors mislead with complicated logic. And I mean this misleading not even intentionally. I'm pretty much think that Hegel believed the nonsense he was writing down. Huh? So just because we explained a lot about negation, in his dialectics, he used this negation a lot. And but he's muddling the case that in his case, it is not clear whether he refers with negation to the logical operation or actually to the what is the opposite by meaning. So instead of the negation of white being not white, then he may imply something like black. And so then he comes to nonsensical statement like heat is the negation of negation, which is nonsense, because he doesn't even apply negation to a variable, doesn't define the variable, and comes up to this. And he uses negation a lot. So you can, so if you don't understand Hegel when he comes up with this, you're actually on the right track, because there is nothing to understand, because it's not. I'm not saying that everything what Hegel wrote is wrong, but where as soon as he uses the word negation, it's likely that that whole paragraph is nonsense.
Well, I think you bring up a good point right there. I mean, that's sort of what Epicurus was saying about that you can formulate an argument to support any position you want to if you're clever enough with your dialectic and your logic and your way of formulating premises and things, and just dazzle people with your, verbal abilities.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And that's the sentence where you wrote that in that sense, you said by logic alone, we cannot derive anything about the real world. In that sense, logic is merely a game. It's obviously, and calling logic a game is a controversial thing to say, but within limits or within your, depending on your perspective, I get you're comfortable saying that.
Yes, and I quoted there my teacher in German because he was a very sharp guy, and he recognized this, so that this is essentially just a game with rules according to those rules. And if you want to talk about reality, then something completely different is important. So that means it's much more important that the reasoning is sound. No? And if it's sound, then this logic part is trivial. I mean, it's still true, it still applies, but it's a trivial part of it. The difficult part is establishing this, no? So that whether any of the proposition, the propositions we work with are true or false, no? Or whether we can actually apply implication. No? So some people may link premises to a conclusion without that this link exists.
Martin, I'm going to go around the table and ask if people have comments, like I just cut off Don from making a comment. But are you finished your presentation and we'll go to Don and then ask others for comments, or do you have more before?
Exactly. We're through with the presentation. Let me just add one more thing, which is important to better understand the law, because here they came up with a table of different operations, and where is it? No, here they don't have it. I thought they have somewhere in it the thing that this arrow. Here this one. Huh? The implication is equivalent to not P or Q. We don't have an arrow here, and this one shows that when we it's just something from how we think of how this implication works. So intuitively, the arrow is correct, but logically, it's equivalent to the statement not P or Q. And then it's arbitrary which one we regard as the premise and which one the conclusion. So that means that logically, that implication operation is not directional, and it doesn't apply anything of causation, because this the connotation of this arrow may be that P is causal for Q, but it's not, because as you can show from the truth table, this implication is equivalent to not P or Q, and this one we can just swap and change as we like. There is no connotation of the causality in this or.
Oh, that's very cool.
All right, Don, let's go to your comment and go around the table.
I just want to make sure that I understand your position, Cassius, and also Martin, I think, brought this up too, that I'm looking at the quote that you had from Cicero's on the nature of the gods, book 1, chapter 25 there. And you said that he was afraid that if he admitted anything of this sort, that in a preposition such as tomorrow Epicurus will either be alive or he will not be alive, that he wouldn't accept that as, you can't say one or the other. And what your position is then, that since Epicurus has agency, that if you say, well, tomorrow Epicurus will be alive, then something could happen in the intervening 24 hours and he'll be dead. And so that your original premise was not correct. So the idea of there being agency and not necessity in the world is why Epicurus would not accept statements like that you could not say whether he was going to be alive or dead tomorrow.
I believe that's the most likely response to that. But Martin, are you about to say something?
Yes, I wanted to remark, Aristotle was aware of it. So he came up with this logical law, but he himself felt uncomfortable whether this really applies to the future.
I guess this really calls attention to the importance that I'm really going to have to end up reading Philodemus's on signs and inferences. So,
right. Right, and that's a great comment, Don. That to the extent we have any text that tries to explain the Epicurean position, Philodemus's own signs is probably where it is. And
Yep.
I keep there's several. There's a Sedley version or commentary apparently, and there's also this DeLacy version that we have that I reference a lot. Because let's use an opportunity to highlight that. From the first time I read DeLacy's version, this paragraph has always just stuck in my mind. Because DeLacy says, and we'll get the page number and so forth, that when he goes back into the history of Epicurean empiricism, he says that Aristotle regards empiricism as inadequate because he believes that observation can never give necessary connections between objects. And so apparently the Aristotelian and even Platonic position is that inferences from signs are not reliable unless you can convert them into a valid syllogism. So it appears to me, if DeLacy's correct, that what Epicurus would have been confronted with was this idea that a thing cannot be considered true unless you can construct a syllogism, a propositional syllogism that can be considered to be proved. And I think at least one part of it has to be related to this issue of necessary connections and necessity, which I think is where we're going in terms of human agency or any time. And again, I want to throw in, just for people researching it, the article that I've always thought was the most impressive to me was an article by A.A. Long entitled Chance and Natural Law in Epicureanism. Professor Long makes the point there that the swerve in nature is there, but he uses the words that Long believes that the swerve doesn't break through very often into our real world, except in cases of animate objects that have agency and free will. Because otherwise, if everything was just, if the swerve was just causing chaos around us every moment, and the sun was rising in the north or the south one day, or in the northwest the next day, you'd have no ability to predict anything. But in general, there is a great deal of predictability in the universe itself. So the swerve is not, in Long's words, breaking through in everyday, in many everyday observations. At least at Epic. Now, of course, we've got the ability to go into the quantum mechanics and electron microscopes and things that Martin can tell us about that would probably modify that conclusion. But at least in the world that human beings live in, it is largely predictable from moment to moment. Not everything, but the thing that stands out as being most unpredictable is what human beings are going to do, or animals who have the ability to have some sense of agency. So that's why this little comment from in Huehne 380 is intriguing to me. I'm not. I wish we could check the text and see exactly what it says at some point. But if it's true that he says that chance is a cause that is uncertain with respect to persons, times, and now places sounds to me like it could potentially be something that should be translated differently. But persons, and then predicting the future in which people are involved, it seems to me would be classic examples of things that should not and cannot be predicted due to human agency or animal agency.
Okay.
That's where I'm going at the moment. Now, you can't predict tomorrow, and humans can change their minds. So I may totally change my mind tomorrow and conclude that was absolutely wrong. But I think that's what Epicurus is probably going towards. Now, again, I just went off on a rant there. Godfrey, we haven't heard much from you tonight. What do you think?
All I can say is this is one of the reasons I like Epicurus so much. I'm kind of speechless with all the logic and tables and all that stuff. I really don't have much to add.
Well, again, the reason we got on this tonight is because, as Martin has correctly pointed out, we want to be as persuasive to as many people as we possibly can. So when we just say simply that Epicurus rejected logic, that's a statement that's far too overbroad. we ought to be as accurate as we can and talk about what it was that Epicurus was rejecting, so that people can't just say that Epicurus, people are going to say that, oh, Epicurus wasn't scientific. Epicurus was, when he threw out reason from the canon of truth, that's just horrendous. We have to consider that Epicurus is not even worthy of thinking about in terms of his logical propositions and his canon of truth. And so obviously canon of truth is something that's closely related to what we're talking about in terms of what truth is and truth tables and so forth. So again, to try to focus as we begin to come to conclusion on what we're going to talk about tonight, what's the best way, Martin, of talking about Epicurus's position? What is it exactly that you think Epicurus was rejecting? No pressure again.
He was rejecting it that you can say something on reality without starting from reality. So that means this requirement that something has to be expressed as a syllogism. And I take this one that you go back to something what you pick up some from ideal words. And so that means just from within logic. You cannot just arrive at a claim on reality. So the logic is a tool how we connect things, but we cannot derive something just based from within logic and then expect that it's necessarily true in reality.
It sounds like you're talking. It sounds like you're talking similarly too, where we've talked before on the forum and I think online as well, that whenever Epicurus tried to stop whichever one it was, the geometer, they take him away from his geometry. That we felt that geometry is a tool, but you can't confuse geometry with the real world. And that sounds like the same thing we're saying about logic too. That it's a tool, but you can't confuse it for the real world.
Yes, it's useful to do something in the real world, but
right.
It may have its limitations there.
Right. And some people don't recognize those limitations and see this as the what's the metaphor? The Joshua might be able to help me out with the Buddhist metaphor. Don't mistake the reflection of the moon in the water for the actual moon.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So, and some of you will have heard this. I bring this up every time the subject of logic comes up because it's a perfect encapsulation of the problem. It ties in geometry. It ties in the heart versus head problem. It ties in logic, and it comes from this film, Lincoln, based on the last roughly year of the life of Abraham Lincoln, who in the film is played by Daniel Day-Lewis. The script, it's a great script. It was written by Tony Kushner. It's a really good film. I love this film. But there's one particular scene in the film in which the president, in the midst of the Civil War, he's confronted with this problem. He's morally opposed to slavery, but the practicality of the ongoing conflict makes it difficult for him to arrive at like a concrete conclusion as to what he's going to do about it. And so in this particular scene in the movie, he's up very late at night and he's getting ready to send off a telegraph. So he's talking to these two engineers, and the subject of Euclid comes up because Lincoln in real life, he did take some time off from his career and he really seriously buckled down and studied Euclid until he could solve all the problems by sight. And so what he says is things that are equal to the same thing are equal to each other. And this is the argument by which he finally convinces himself that he's going to take this step to abolish slavery. He's already made the moral decision, but he needs this logical underpinning for some reason. And I love this because he's using geometry to buttress like what he sees as a moral truth. Things that are equal to the same thing are equal to each other. There's nothing in that formulation, that Euclidean formulation of pure geometry, that can get you from geometry to we should abolish slavery. But this is the leap that he makes in the film, and we should post that again on the forum. I know I've posted it in a few different places. So this is one of the problems with logic, is the attempt to prove too much with bad premises and conclusions that don't follow, when you don't necessarily need to do that. The moral argument against slavery was already made, and it didn't need this geometric proof to get there, you know.
So
I don't know
it-
how exactly
no,
that ties in here, but
I mean, we can see there is an analogy. So it doesn't prove it, but there's an analogy which somehow satisfies our desire for symmetry, no?
yeah.
and consistency. No?
Well, it helps sell it, it sounds like.
Oh yeah. Well, he was selling it to himself, more or less.
Yeah.
And I mean, that seems to talk too about the whole idea that the people like to have. That's almost a and correct me if I'm overreaching here, but that's almost a Platonic ideal sort of thing, that he needed some sort of idealistic underpinning to his rational, or his emotional reaction to it.
It is. It's a curious case because the premise is true, essentially. The conclusion, at least morally for most people, is thought to be true, and yet it doesn't. The argument doesn't really make sense. It's hard to wrap your head around. But
Yeah.
I compare it to Pythagoras, who, and this is another. This is a book that I love. It's The Rise and Fall of Alexandria, in which it describes how Pythagoras and his followers arrived at like the perfect, pure, true mathematical number, which they decided was 10. And they arrived at that because if you have 1 point, I got to think about this now. If you got 1, that's a point. If you got 2, that's a line. If you have 3, that's a plane. And if you have 4, that is a solid. And so by adding up 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, you get to 10. And then he turns around, and because 10 is the perfectly mathematical number, he decides that there are 10 spheres, the heavenly spheres. So you've got whatever the known planets were at that time, and then the stars are their own sphere, the sun is its own sphere, the moon is its own sphere. And so he starts with just pure math, and he tries to prove astronomy based on pure math, and it the way he was doing it, it doesn't work. Of course, we know there are, concentric spheres around a stationary Earth, but he was using logic to prove that, based on the idea that 10 was the perfect number.
And that was a almost an article of faith as far as astronomy goes for quite some time, with the whole concentric spheres and embedded Matryoshka doll universe.
Yeah, that's a good point too. The nesting dolls, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting too that a lot of I've been reading this book on the pre-Socratics lately, and that's where a lot of them are coming from, not so much coming from Pythagoras, but they're trying to reason out a cosmology. And that's kind of eventually people reasoning off of other people's reasoning ended up with atomism. And some people reasoned way before Socrates that the Earth was not the center of the cosmos, but then they said maybe it was the sun. They didn't get the whole picture that we have now, but they didn't have the science and they didn't have the observational abilities. So those were the tools they had to work with.
Yeah, Anaxagoras was the first to say that the sun was not a god; it was a hot rock or something like that.
Yeah,
and actually, that was one at Socrates' trial for his life. This is one of the accusations that was leveled against him, and his response was, "That's a problem for Anaxagoras."
We posted in we'll in we'll work on this thread and preserve what we've done tonight as a podcast, hopefully. But one of the things that I found that is already posted in the thread is the discussion of Pythagoras' system. And I see a couple of comments that are relevant to what Joshua just said. It says that the overriding dictum of Pythagoras' school was that all is number, or that God is number. But then it also says that based on this mathematical system, the Pythagoreans concluded that you should never urinate towards the sun, you should never marry a woman who wears gold jewelry, and you should never pass an ass lying in the street, or never eat or even touch a black bean. So that would probably be good examples of mathematical thinking that's not really connected to reality.
I have heard that the beans that people try and say that, well, he was against eating beans. I've heard it said that since black and white beans were used for casting votes in the assembly and that sort of thing, that what he was saying was, don't touch the beans, don't get involved in politics, don't try to be part of that world. That he was saying that that was the whole bean idea, and it wasn't necessarily the eating of the beans, it was getting involved in politics and the jury trials and all that sort of thing.
Is there go ahead.
Henry David Thoreau actually makes a little play on that. I think it's in Walden. I can't remember which book it's in, but he's actually, it's in Civil Disobedience. He's explaining why he doesn't vote, and he says, I'm a Pythagorean by nature, whether it means porridge or voting.
Oh, wow. I was unaware of that. That's very cool.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I'll have to look that one up now.
Okay. Never mind. I realized it is in Walden because he was raising beans, which he then traded for rice. And after he says, and I traded the beans for the rice, I'm a Pythagorean by nature, whether it means porridge or voting.
Oh, that's great. Oh, that's
pretty
awesome.
Detailed knowledge. Yeah.
That's great.
Well, we're probably coming to the end of our presentation for tonight. Anybody have closing comments? Again, thank you, Martin, for all the effort that you put into preparing this for us tonight. That was really a lot of work and very helpful, because it's certainly a subject that I don't ever get tired of talking about, because I frankly think that there's some things like this about Epicurus that are probably much more unique and important about the way he thought, even than some of his ideas on pleasure and some of the other things that we talk about much more regularly.
Bite your tongue.
It's important too.
That would be painful, though. I don't know.
Well, that's true.
It's important too, because the kind of person who's going to be probably drawn to Epicureanism or find themselves, brushing up against it in a philosophical conversation, it's the kind of person who values rational thinking. And I know I considered myself to be that kind of person. So when you find out this claim that's made that Epicurus threw out logic, that's a hard pill to swallow.
I would presume,
it's a lot of things too. I mean, think whenever we say that he was against formal logic or prepositional logic, or however we want to say it. I mean, you come back to the fact that he was not against rational thinking. I mean, phronesis and practical wisdom is one of the three things that he says that are useful in a pleasurable life. So it's not the fact that he threw out rationality or thinking about things deeply, but this whole idea of that logic is a reflection of reality seems to me, after this conversation tonight, to be what he's really going against.
Convincingly portrays him here as really a deep logical thinker, to have seen through the veil that was, logic is hard to penetrate sometimes. I know, like I mentioned, I took a course on it in college. It's the difficult nut to crack.
Because one of Don's many favorite doctrines of Epicurus is principal doctrine 16. In but few things chance hinders a wise man, but the greatest and most important matters reason has ordained, and throughout the whole period of life does and will ordain. So Epicurus preaches in favor of reason at the same time that he's ejecting propositional logic or dialectic, as the word frequently appears in the text, it looks like, from his canon of truth. And there's no inconsistency between those two positions.
Yeah, well put. Well put.
Yep.
Certainly
Also,
no Godfrey, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, you look at the how so many of his conclusions have held up and are still relevant today. That puts the fact that he rejected the dialecticians or dialectic, it kind of makes you consider it more. I mean, if his philosophy came across as a bunch of nonsense and he said that he rejected dialectic, that would be one thing, but it's been so influential and is so important in so many things affecting our lives today that, I mean, that's kind of how I come to it, which is, I guess, a way more general way than what we've been talking about tonight. But
yeah, I think a lot of modern people are more Epicurean than what they think they are.
Yeah, I agree.
But they're not consistent with it, So they ask,
It's a good point.
but not consistent.
Yep,
Right.
Good point.
Okay, well, sounds like we're about to wrap up. Anybody have any final comments? Not only thanks to Martin, but thank everybody else who participated tonight. And I'll put together a version of this that hopefully we can circulate. And then if we have any problems with the edited version, we can work on that as well and improve it in the future. But this is probably the first time we've tried to tackle this. I'm certainly the first time we've tried to tackle it in any kind of audio-visual presentation, and so I'm very pleased we could get this done.
Thank you very much, Martin. That was fascinating.
Right.
Yeah, welcome.
Okay, well, it's very late over in Germany.
They're actually early now, so I could actually choose.
It's what's that? What's that?
It's actually quite early, so I could decide to stay up and start my day.
That's exactly right. Everybody who listens to this podcast needs to realize that he has stayed up basically overnight in order to help us with this. So thank you again, Martin. Okay, well, and with that, we'll let you go, Martin, and we'll talk to each other again soon. So thanks, everybody.
Happy 20th, everybody.
Happy 20th. Yes. Good night.
Mm-hmm.
Good night.